Okay, so this is the review for Iran and Nigeria. Okay, so we have a little chart, so let's kind of start with that for Iran and Nigeria. It's kind of a good way to review the countries. So Iran, federal or unitary? This could be interactive.
Okay.
It's unitary, and Nigeria is federal. Parliamentary presidential mix, so we're mixed. In Iran, we are presidential. In Nigeria, remember, when all else fails for Nigeria, pick what's most like the U.S. Head of state, head of government. Alright, so in Nigeria it's easy because it's the president, right? Which in this instance right now is Buhari, which I believe I spelled correctly. Alright, what about in Iran? So what are our two choices? We've got Ayatollah and we have the president. So the Ayatollah is our head of state. Ayatollah Khamenei, which maybe I feel like I'm missing a vowel in here somewhere. And the head of government is president, which at this point is Rouhani. Which we have an extra vowel there. Ayatollah also is supreme leader. For our legislature, we are unicameral, modulés, which I'm still waiting to make sure I'm saying that correctly. And then in Nigeria, it is bicameral, the Federal Assembly, which is the Senate. So the Federal Assembly, which is made up of the Senate and the House of Representatives. Okay. For electoral systems, both countries use first past the post. For single-member district, winner take all. Remember that for presidents, there is a runoff election. In Iran, you have to get over 50% to avoid a runoff, same as it is in Russia. And they take the top two candidates and run again. That's one of the reasons that President Ahmadinejad's re-election was contested, because he got over 60%, which he didn't even get the first time he was elected, when he was less popular and, as John Green likes to say, less crazy. The runoff for Nigeria, remember that you have to get 25% of the vote in 2/3 of the states. And so that is because Nigeria is so diverse. When we're thinking about kind of other little fact things, remember that patron clientelism, the particular form in Nigeria is prebendalism, which is their type of patron-client relationship, which facilitates a lot of the corruption that happens in Nigeria. Remember when we're thinking, you know, when I think of the countries, I kind of like to think of maybe one word or two words that help me think about the country. And when I'm thinking about Nigeria, the words that I would think of would be ethnic groups. The fact that there are three major ethnic groups, the Hausa, Fulani, the Yoruba, and the Igbo. But the fact that the country has, you know, basically 250 different ethnic groups. Which brings us to the national question, you know, should Nigeria even be a country? The other thing that I think about with Nigeria is I think about corruption and how this has been a problem. Corruption in the government has just been rampant, even since they've been independent since 1960. When we think about Nigeria, they've had this history of, you know, since 1960 we've seen 7 coups. We're currently in the 4th Republic, and things are more stable than they probably have been any other time. Buhari had probably one of the least fraudulent elections. That has been a problem in the past. So we would consider Nigeria to be an illiberal democracy. I would say it's definitely a democracy, but the fraudulent elections might be kind of holding it back. In Iran, we would not argue that it's a democracy at all. We would argue that it is authoritarian. You could argue that it is illiberal in some instances, but we come back to, again, is there free, fair, competitive elections? So let's see. Nigeria, I would say illiberal. democracy, and I would say authoritarian for Iran. When I think, what's that one word that I want to think of for Iran? I'm thinking, it's really kind of a two-word thing, but I'm thinking theocratic republic. Which also brings me back to that question of what elements of Iran are democratic and what elements are religious. And so when we think theocracy, it is some positions are elected and some are religious. For theocratic, what would you say would be theocratic positions? Ayatollah, the Guardian Council, the Assembly of Religious Experts. Remember, when we're thinking what positions are directly elected, we're thinking democratic. Remember that the Assembly of Religious Experts are elected, the Expediency Council is elected, the President is elected. And so we do see elements of both theocracy and republic. Remember, our magic date for this country is 1979, when we had the revolution. Let's kind of come back here to the to our test review so I don't get too far off track. Describe the Iranian middle class. So remember that your middle class is going to be more Western, more educated. They might tend to be more wealthy, but the wealthier you are, probably the more likely you are to be a little more pro-West, or at least more in favor of, even if you're not in favor of the West, you're more in favor of secularization, kind of that separation of mosque and state that we do not see in Iran right now. Remember that the Iranian Revolution was successful because of the corruption and abuse of power of the Shah. And so the Shah, remember we use the example of his wife used to take baths in milk, just that kind of ridiculous excess that they had there. And so then, and they'd gotten so far away from kind of the religious roots. So when Khomeini having that amazing charismatic authority, when he comes in, people are listening to him. And remember, his biggest support base was kind of your poor peasant class. He does bring in and kind of sets up kind of a couple important things. Remember that Iran functions under Sharia law. And with that is that idea of jurist guardianship, which is that idea that only the senior clerics can interpret the law. And of course, the senior person is the Ayatollah. Remember that the head of the judiciary is chosen by the Ayatollah. What groups are most likely to not support the current regime? The hardline conservatives will probably say, like, Rouhani's not conservative enough. And then, of course, people who are more educated and more in favor of westernization or secularization would be against the current regime.
So more like educated and more wealthy.
Exactly. Educated and wealthy. Alright, well, we'll go over the powers of the different kind of groups that we need to do. Before we do that, I want to kind of hit a couple of these other questions first. Why did the U.S. help overthrow the Shah? The predominant reason was because of our interest in Iranian oil. Because Iran had nationalized oil, we didn't like that. We led the overthrow of Mohammad Mossadegh, the prime minister. Women in Iran, remember that they are allowed to go to college. We have an increasing, there's actually getting to be more women enrolled in college than men. I'll mention too, like population growth. So for a while, the population had kind of been too high. They're trying to cut it back. But just like China's trying to seeing a trend, a change in their population, same thing in Iran, that they're wanting to now encourage growth. So there's a proposed bill to actually ban birth control. So they're kind of changing some of their policies to encourage population growth, even limiting the number of positions that can be held by a woman. Jobs, that was one of the things that they were proposing to do as well. Protests in Iran in 2009 were due to the re-election of President Ahmadinejad, which many believe to be fraudulent elections. There's a lot of evidence that supports that they probably were. Remember that OPEC is the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. Both Iran and Nigeria are members of OPEC. So that's going to lead us to talking about the kind of different parts of Iran. So I'm going to erase this and we're going to look at specifically some of the kind of power and organizations in Iran. There's the great chart that we did, was in our notes, of the, kind of powers of the president versus powers of the Ayatollah. So we've got the Ayatollah, or supreme leader. And we have the president, we have the guardian council, we have the assembly of religious experts, and we have the parliament, which is the majlis in Iran, in Farsi. Okay, so who is directly elected? The assembly of religious experts, the president, and parliament members are directly elected. The Ayatollah is chosen by the members of the Assembly of Religious Experts, and he serves for life. The Ayatollah chooses 6 members of the Guardian Council, which are clerics. The other 6 members are lawyers or people educated in law. They are chosen by the Chief Justice, approved by Parliament. The Chief Justice, though, is chosen by the Ayatollah, so in essence he picks the Guardian Council. The Guardian Council has 2 very, very important powers. They have the ability to veto and the ability to vet. So the vetting is extremely important because the vetting means that they get a list of all potential candidates, people who are interested in running, including for president and for parliament, and they then can say yes or no. So I believe it was last election there was 1,000 people who applied and they only picked like 70. I think I might be getting my numbers wrong, but they go through and they vet out candidates. So these are 2 very important powers that they have. The Ayatollah has the most power. He's in charge of the media. He oversees the media. He oversees the prayer leaders. He oversees the military. And it really, if you can think of a power, pretty much Ayatollah has it. The president, what few powers he does have is he can choose the cabinet. He can propose legislation, but when we think of like traditional powers of commander-in-chief and things like that, it's going to fall in the hands of the Ayatollah.
So, like, the Guardian Council, 6 of them are chosen by the Ayatollah, and the other 6 are by the Parliament?
The Chief Justice, who he gives a list to Parliament, and they say yes or no.
Okay.
But remember, the Chief Justice is chosen by the Ayatollah. So in essence, the Ayatollah kind of is approving whoever's the list that's going to the Guardian Council here. Yeah, there's a lot of power in those 12 men there. So, the Assembly of Religious Experts can actually get rid of the Ayatollah. He can be taken from his office, but mostly he serves for life. There's only been 2 Ayatollahs so far, and the first Ayatollah was Khomeini, which again had a wonderful example of charismatic authority, and then Khomeini with an A is our current supreme leader Ayatollah. I know. I'll mention quickly political parties. Political parties, remember, tend to be more based on like a particular person, or they sometimes can fall like the moderates, conservatives kind of groups, but for the most time they tend to be more around people, personalities, which is similar to how they are in Russia. Remember that political parties in Nigeria tend to be regional, which is our first thing under Nigeria. The basis of political parties, they do tend to be more regional. You ladies have any questions on Iran before I move on to Nigeria? How has democratization gone in Nigeria? So when we think about Nigeria has had a history of coups. since their independence. Remember when they became independent, they tried to be British, copy the British system, and tried to be parliamentary. It didn't work for them. With such a diverse nation, getting a majority to actually have a prime minister was difficult, and so they decided to switch to being a federal republic and copied the American style constitution. And so democracy also faces many challenges in Nigeria when the fact that so many people are uneducated. Literacy continues to be a huge problem when you're thinking that only in the high 60s of your country, maybe around 67% are actually literate. This is a huge problem. And the fact that 61% of the country lives in poverty, that so many people live on less than $2 a day. When you're focused on what you're going to eat, you're not really worried about voting. The fact also that Nigeria is so diverse in ethnic groups also has made it difficult to kind of unify the country. Nigerians mostly identify as what ethnic group they are before they often identify as Nigerian. The biggest problem facing Nigeria since independence, well, what do you think it is? I would say political instability, the coups. You could argue corruption, which is tied to that. I think either one of those would be a fine answer. I think you could even argue the ethnic diversity, too. The patronage system, we mentioned already, the fact that they are, prebendalism is the fact of patronage. They are a corporatist state. Remember that every country that we study except for Mexico and Britain are corporatist. Britain and Mexico are pluralist.
Can you go over like what that means again?
Yeah, basically your interest groups, like how diversified they are and whether or not they're tied to the government. And so if the government is controlling them, that's going to be corporatist. If they're allowed to be kind of independent on their own, that's pluralist.
Okay. And then for like the unitary and federal, so like they're unitary if they have,
Unitary means that your power is centralized and you don't give as much to the states or regions.
Okay.
So like the UK, China, and Iran are unitary. The federal are, like we're federal, because the states, it's shared power. That's the difference. You're thinking federalism versus unitary. And your other option of a government is confederal. The majority of the world is unitary. It's only, I feel like it's less than 30 countries that are federal in the world. Nigeria compared to the other CG6 countries in relation to GDP, literacy, etc. Obviously Nigeria is much less developed than all the other countries that we've studied. Their GDP is, GDP per capita is half of any of the worst countries that we've studied. Literacy rate, is abysmal, only in the high 60s. So they're definitely a developing nation. Electoral system in Nigeria we discussed. They do single-member districts. They do runoff elections for their presidents. We've also discussed ethnic groups. I'll mention them again. We have the Hassau Fulani, which are predominantly in the north, and they are the largest group, I think around 29%, I believe. And they are predominantly north, and they're predominantly Muslim. The Igbo are in the south, and they are predominantly Christian, making up about 18%. And then the Yoruba are a mix of Christian and Muslim, and they make up about 21% of the population. They are more in urban areas, specifically in Lagos is where we find most of them. And the national question, again, is the whole thing, should Nigeria even be a country, or should they split up into smaller? Like Biafra, when they tried to break off. Biafra was, remember, supported by the Igbos. This was the movement to start their own country. The problem was that they tried to also take the oil reserves from the near areas, and they were controlling most of the oil. Led to a civil war in Nigeria. Both of these countries are rentier states. Remember that a rentier state is where a country makes the majority of its revenue off of, either renting out that resource, but it comes tied to a resource. In the case of Iran, they nationalized their oil. In the case of Nigeria, there are no Nigerian-owned oil refineries. They're owned predominantly by the British and Americans. Both legislatures don't have a whole lot of power, although I would argue they definitely have more power than, say, China. Remember that the National People's Congress of China is just a rubber stamp, versus Iran. They do actually pass laws, and it's not a rubber stamp institution. When we're thinking at this point, comparison with any other country is fair game. So like, for example, the Iranian Revolution, similar to the Mexican Revolution. Remember that the Iranian Revolution is a cultural revolution. They're overthrowing, absolute power, but they're bringing in a theocracy. They're bringing in religion. They're wanting to go back to what they used to be. They're wanting to do away with the white revolution that the Shah had done. The white revolution, remember, was an attempt to kind of westernize and secularize Iran. The Mexican Revolution, too, was getting rid of absolute rule, but they definitely set up two very different countries as a result of that. All right, we're looking on the back. There's kind of a couple of questions, just to maybe get us thinking on. Did you have any other specific questions on Nigeria?
What was so further into your state, Iran is like the government owns everything, and then Nigeria, most of it's owned by like us and Britain.
Yes.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. So, and can't really argue that Mexico's a rentier state anymore. At one point maybe, but oil is not the majority of their anymore. I think Iran and Nigeria are best examples.
Wait, what did it say?
Some people, we can't really, Iran and Nigeria are the best examples of rentier state.
Oh,
Yeah, sorry. Okay, define a theocracy. Theocracy is obviously when we have a government where we have no separation of religion and government. In the case of Iran, we're talking about no separation of mosque and state. Remember, there's very few theocracies in the world, only about a dozen. What makes Iran different than every other theocracy in the world is the fact that Iran is a republic, and the fact that they actually have some democratic elements. And that is very possibly going to be a question, and I mentioned that already. What elements of Iran are democratic? What elements are theocratic? I've also mentioned charismatic authority already. Charismatic authority is that idea that where it just brings people in, and it is a source of legitimacy, and people follow someone just because of that. We've mentioned Mao, we've mentioned Stalin, and Khomeini is an excellent example. Two similarities in the goals of the Great Cultural Revolution in China and the Cultural Revolution in Iran. One of the things that, and I almost think this really should be differences, would actually be a better word than similarities. The Cultural Revolution in Iran wants to return to traditional ways. The Cultural Revolution in China wants to get rid of traditional ways. The Cultural Revolution in Iran is focused on religion. And remember, in China, atheism is encouraged. Religion is definitely not encouraged. When we look at how colonialism affected Nigeria, remember that Nigeria was a British colony, and that originally Nigeria followed the British style, the parliamentary style. Britain also left a divided country, with so many different ethnic groups, and that has definitely hurt them. They do have the common language of English. Remember that a lot of people, speak there's so many different dialects and hundreds of dialects in Nigeria, but they do have the common colonial language of English. We've discussed ethnic cleavages, we've discussed patron clientelism, we've discussed aid is kind of a repeat there too. How has Iran encouraged democratization? By having offices that are, of course, directly elected, what do you think discourages democracy? I don't know, vetting. The fact that they vet their candidates, that's going to be definitely against democratization. When we look at Nigerian and Iranian presidents, who is more powerful, the Nigerian president or the Iranian president?
No, the Nigerian.
Nigerian president has more power because remember the Iranian president is always kind of under the Ayatollah. Now, if I said who has more power, the Ayatollah or Nigerian president, obviously the Ayatollah. The good question is, who has more power, the Ayatollah or President Putin? That's really a good question. Probably about the same amount of power. Well, the Ayatollah can serve for life, and right now Putin cannot serve for life. Though I'm sure he will as long as he can. We've discussed how that the Guardian Council does the vetting of anybody who runs for Parliament. That's number 11. And they have to be vetted. When we look at these kind of other questions, and we're not going to have this Mexico-Nigeria question, but this number 12 where it says describe federalism in Nigeria. Remember that a reason a country would choose federalism is to help give more authority to those local regions. You know, there's 36 regions, or we would say states, in Nigeria, and allowing them to have say over their own country gives them, that's what federalism, that's the reason that it exists, because they might know better what to serve their region. You know, even within Nigeria, they responded to that by the North having Sharia law, the fact that that is allowed in the North where it is predominantly Muslim. But remember, there is a problem that resources are not allocated very necessarily fairly in Nigeria. The fact that around the Niger Delta, like that's where the big source of oil is, and it's not necessarily getting spread out to everybody else. We looked at several, diagrams, and we've seen that there's definitely not a fair allocation of resources. Definitely a lot poorer in the north. So, I would say that the way the electoral system accommodates different ethnic groups is the fact that you have to appeal to a vast majority, because as president you have to have 2/3 of the country supporting you, 2/3 of the state, so you're appealing to different groups. And the current president, he chose a vice presidential running mate to complement him. The president is Muslim, and he chose a Christian running mate to complement him. So these two samples, 12 and 13, they're not going to be the question that we see there. But we may be looking at federalism versus unitary for Iran versus Nigeria.
Wait, so for how it's able to unresolve tensions, you said it's a Muslim president but a Christian
Vice president.
Okay.
That could be one example.
Okay.
Or, and I think they're probably, I think they're different ethnic groups. I forget which is, I know that Buhari is a South Fulani, so I'm not sure about, and I know Jonathan Goodluck was, I'm not 100% sure he was an Igbo.